Before we get to this week's guest, we have a lot of women who listen to the podcast who are not of any faith or aren't Christians. I want to welcome everyone and thank everyone for listening. When women share on the podcast, I always want them to share from their own personal faith or paradigm. That means that I frequently share from my own, and this podcast is not just for members of my church, but for everybody. We have a member of our community on today's episode who comes from a Muslim background, although she converted to Christianity. We're going to call her Nadira. Nadira and I are going to be talking about covert emotional abuse. And as she shares her story, I'm going to stop and point out 6 examples of covert emotional abuse. Welcome, Nadira.
Hi, Anne. I have to say that's something I really appreciate about your podcast because I know that you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so when I first started listening, I thought maybe it was just for people that belong to that faith. But as I listened to the podcasts, it was really encouraged to me that this is just for all women who come from all different types of faith backgrounds. But the truth is, we share this thing in common in that we've all been abused. It's been really comforting for me to hear from all different types of women who have all different types of beliefs.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, that's really important to me that everyone feels welcome here. Everyone has different epiphanies based on their experience. I want women to be able to share those so that other women can hear them and realize they're not alone and that we're all so similar. Thanks for saying that. I appreciate it. Let's talk about your story. Did you recognize abusive behaviors in the beginning?
What I will say is yes and no. No, I didn't have a category or the right verbiage for it, but what I did know was something was terribly wrong from the very beginning. I'm Middle Eastern. My dad is from the Middle East, and I was raised Muslim but came to faith as a Christian when I was 16. I took that decision really seriously and devoted my life to my faith. It was like life changing for me. And when I met my ex husband, he was on full time staff with a Christian organization. He was basically a missionary. We were actually taking Bible classes together when I met him. He checked all the boxes. He is a master manipulator, like a lot of men I've heard about on this podcast. And so sadly, I kept thinking, well, if I would change, or maybe I'm being ridiculous, I kept questioning myself. But innately, I knew something was terribly wrong. On our honeymoon, my ex husband actually decided to play volleyball in a 2-on-2 tournament for 2 days in a row with a totally hot woman in her bikini and flirt with her the whole time. Now, I asked him about it. I'm a person who's forthright in what I feel. And I told him I felt hurt, said that I didn't want him to do it. And the next day he did it again.
Oh, wow. Wow. On your honeymoon. I'm so sorry. So that's our first example of covert emotional abuse. It was his absolute lack of consideration for you on your honeymoon. Like he was more into this other person than his own wife on her honeymoon. I am so sorry. I mean, how did the rest of the honeymoon go?
In the conversations with him, I always came away feeling like I was being overly jealous. I was insane. And so, right from the get go, there was a precedent set that he could do whatever he wanted and flip it all around. And I would feel like, what is wrong with me? That continued. And so, in my gut, I always knew there was something terribly wrong. But my ex-husband, like so many people I've heard about on this podcast, which really helped me not feel alone, by the way, he's very well liked. He's always been the pastor's best friend. He's a successful businessman. He was actually a star athlete. He had this Opie Taylor image that he was just this shucks, unassuming guy, and everyone loved and trusted him. And so I always felt like, what's wrong with me? And he would say that to me, like, what's wrong with you? Everybody else loves me. But in our home, I was extremely neglected. I was a newlywed. I just moved across the country. I felt very alone. We lived in a house that had been built in 1948, so it was very small. He would disappear into the office for hours, and he would work long hours outside of the home as well. And in his free time, he was either in the office or he was watching TV. And I was so lonely. I was 7 months pregnant, and I thought, I'm going to leave and see if he even notices. So I left the house 7 months pregnant in an unsafe area, by the way. And 2.5 hours later, he calls me and says, "What are you doing? Where are you at?" It took 2.5 hours for him to even notice that I had left our little 1,200 square foot house. So the neglect was really extreme.
That's our second example of covert emotional abuse. Emotional neglect, like he didn't even notice that you were missing. I can imagine in that situation, you would feel so alone. I went through that too because right after I got married, I moved to be with my ex and I felt so alone too. And he would just take off and not tell me where he was going. What else did you notice early on other than the emotional neglect?
Really, pretty early on, 1 week prior to our oldest child's birth, I had gone downstairs earlier than normal and caught my ex husband looking at pornography.
And there is example number 3. So, the third example of covert emotional abuse is secretly using pornography. It's covert because you can't see it because he's hiding it from you.
Prior to marriage, I had actually asked him, which is very abnormal at the time, but I had asked him about pornography because I had heard of a story where pornography had really invaded a marriage. And so I asked him what his experience with pornography was. And of course, he lied to me and said he didn't have a problem or any issues with it. I went through all the normal feelings of what's wrong with me? Why am I not enough? Does he love me? All those questions that are normal. So when I caught him 1 week prior to the birth of our first child, at that point I knew, okay, there's something much deeper going on here that's not about me.
Lying is example number 4. Lying is covert emotional abuse. You're resisting the entire time, knowing that something was wrong, and in your efforts to resist, where else did you turn for help?
Yeah, I tried a lot of things. I'm just a proactive person, especially in relationships. From the very beginning, I was reaching out for marriage counseling, for pastoral counseling, to do marriage workshops. He worked for a well known Christian organization and they had resources for us. So we were utilizing all of those resources. And in all of that, he could answer and look like a shining great guy, but no one was in our home to see the neglect. For other listeners out there who can relate to this, I wanted to share this. So, my ex husband was not a screamer or a yeller. He did push me once or twice, which is abuse. That was in a really extreme moment, and it was not the norm. He did everything with a smile on his face. So, he was always cool, calm, collected, and always smiling. So, all of the neglect, all of the flirting with other women in front of me, and the sexually inappropriate stuff he's done with our children has all been done with a smile on his face. It was not this ogre like persona.
Let's pause here for just a second to point out the fifth example of covert emotional abuse. It doesn't look bad. It looks nice and kind. He looks like a responsible, upstanding person. And that's why it's covert, because you cannot see it. Before we get to the inappropriate things that he did with your kids, can we go back to marriage counseling? When you were doing pastoral counseling, did anyone identify the abuse or identify him as an abuser?
Never, not one time. So, to give you a little history, I caught him. Well, then I caught him again, and then he seemed to be doing well for years. And then the last time I caught him, it had escalated for years. There was a lot I didn't know. He had been having affairs, he had been engaging with prostitutes, he had brought prostitutes into our home on several occasions. He had done all these horrific things to our family. And at that point, even, I was told it was sex addiction. So then we went the sex addiction route for years. Even when he went to treatment, which he did go to treatment for sex addiction, which I think was a huge waste of $50,000 because it really just upped his pathology and made him more dangerous. And then I knew he was going back to quote unquote addiction even before he got caught again. But the truth was, I didn't want to be in a relationship with a manipulator, a liar, a cheater, a psychologically abusive person. So I filed for divorce.
Yeah, I hear that all the time. Time and time again, women tell me their story about how their husband went to sex addiction therapy or abuse cessation therapy. And it was not only a waste of time and money, but he actually got worse. So it was like paying $50,000 to make him worse. So that is the sixth example of covert emotional abuse. There's no resolution. They give you the impression that they're going to get help, but then they use that proximity to you and their promise to you that they're going to change as a way to continue to exploit you.
It was very traumatizing because here I had all this hope for help, and it ended up being more dangerous for our family in the long run. And yet, I believe that the people that were at treatment had good intentions. And I think it may work for someone, I don't know. But in our case, it really upped his pathology, and he's that much more dangerous.
When do you start to recognize that it's abuse?
Well, I'll be honest, Anne, it's been listening to your podcast. My therapist recommended your podcast to me. I've only been listening to your podcast for 6 months, so it's only been the last 6 months, and it's been a complete paradigm shift for me. And it's actually totally changed my life. This is why, when it was sex addiction, there is this idea that he's a sick person and he needs empathy. It's just a sick person who has like cancer, for example. And so that's how we treated it as a family. In the meantime, he's still doing horrific things to the children. And so it was listening to every single one of these podcasts that really made my whole paradigm shift and go, you know what? It's not sex addiction. It's just an extremely abusive, I believe, sociopath is what I believe he is. He lacks empathy, which allows him to do horrific things to his family and to his children, like introduce his children to prostitutes with a smile on his face. On a regular basis, he would become aroused around the children when playing with them and not when they were physically touching each other. What I mean is, like, they weren't body on body. He would just become aroused. And that was something I had addressed before he ever got caught in full blown sex addiction with prostitutes. I had been talking to our pastor, to our counselors, and everyone was like, that's really weird. But, they would just tell him, like, get away from the children. But that had been going on for years. Since our two oldest children were 4 years old and 2 years old, he would be aroused playing with the children. I never caught child pornography, but I'd only caught him using porn twice. And they were like 4 years apart. We had covenant eyes and all that, but he is a master manipulator. He lived a whole double life. I will tell you, everyone who found out our story in our friend group was like, he's the last person I ever expected. He was always the pastor's best friend.
That's why they're so dangerous. When I talk to people about how pornography use is abusive, if you catch them, you don't know what else is going on. They're not going to tell you.
They only admit what they get caught with. Even if, quote unquote, it is just porn, unless you've agreed upon that in your relationship, that is abuse. That's lying, that's coercion, that's manipulating. I want to read you this really quick. I have this handbook from the Domestic Violence Victims Handbook. I picked it up at Children's Services. It describes abuse, right? And under the different headings, there's like coercion, making the victim feel guilty, pushing the victim into decisions, sulking, manipulating children and other family members, always insisting on being right, making impossible rules and punishing the victim for breaking them. Talks about emotional withdrawing, economic control. A lot of these behaviors described in this are exactly what I went through and what our children went through and still go through. And yet, he's not a physically abusive person. He does it all with a smile. I was told, and I know I'm not alone in this, that if I would be more loving and more kind, and there's a passage in 1 Peter 3 that talks about submitting without a word, that he would be a more loving husband.
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of abuse is to silence your victim. It silenced me. I literally felt like I was dying inside, and he went off the rails. When he got caught, like really caught, we were broke because he had spent all of our money on women. So, me trying to do whatever it takes to save my marriage, it hurt me in the long run because literally at the end of the day, we were broke. He had destroyed everything. He had sexually abused our children. If we're friends and you come to me and you say, I'm being abused, I want to help you get help and get to a safe place. But if you come to me and say, my husband's a sex addict, there's a whole different approach. And your safety is not the main concern, which is crazy to me. The main concern is him, which is just enabling him to, like in our case, up his pathology and become more dangerous. So your podcast, it's made a huge difference to me. It's really just changed everything because instead of treating it like addiction and all the ways I was taught, because I went to Al-Anon for years and stuff like that, I am treating it like, no, we are victims. He's an abuser and we need to be safe. And we are currently in court over custody issues. He's lost complete custody of our oldest. We're trying to free the younger children from the abuse. It's a totally different perspective because I don't treat it like it's an addiction and, oh, he just needs to get help. I actually don't believe there's help for him. I believe he's a sociopath and that literally we just need to get safe to a safe place.
Mm-hmm. Even if there was some kind of help for him, the point is still the same. If the person isn't safe, it doesn't matter if they can become safe or not. They're not currently safe, period. We need to protect ourselves. With your ex, I tend to agree with you. He's not ever going to change. But if he could, hypothetically, it would not matter. We still need to protect ourselves because he's not safe. That is the most fundamental thing that most people don't understand. They think if somebody can become safe, then we don't need to protect ourselves. And instead, we need to be patient and kind and loving. And I'm like, no, 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 no. It doesn't matter if they can change or not. That's not the issue. The issue is I need to protect myself now because they're not safe now. Period. And that's why I wrote the Living Free strategies because they give women enough space to observe, to see, am I safe now? And then it also teaches women strategies to protect themselves. To get more information about that, go to btr.org/livingfree. In your case, you filed for divorce to protect yourself, and I'm so sorry that it's still a struggle to keep your children safe. That is such a common problem. After what you've been through, knowing what you know now, what insights could you share with women who might be in your same situation?
My faith had a lot to do, I believe, with a lot of the decisions I made. And God does not value marriage over my relationship with God. And that seems like a very obvious point, but I kept feeling like the counsel I was getting from the pastors and lay people was that I needed to do whatever it takes, including enduring extreme abuse, to stay married and keep a family together. And yet, my children endured more abuse because I was trying to please God in that way. And marriage, in a lot of ways, in some churches or communities of faith, is held above a woman and children's safety, emotional and mental well being. Because, that kind of abuse long term, I got to really desperate places. I got to places where I didn't want to live anymore. It took me to those places. I believe everything happens for a reason, but I can't imagine what my life would have been like if I would have gotten out of that abuse a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
The hard thing, though, is that Sodom and Gomorrah looked really evil. And so did the Egyptians, right? But in our case, he looked like literally the best guy ever. The thing that's discounted or not talked about a ton, and you do a good job of talking about it here, is yeah, okay, let's say he is just looking at pornography behind your back and lying to you and coercing and manipulating you. Well, what are the effects of that on the family? It doesn't happen in a black hole by itself. It's not an isolated event. It affects how he treats you and the children. It affects how he sees you and the children. It affects so many areas of your life, your time, your money. And so it's not an isolated thing. It affects everyone. My ex-husband getting aroused around our children on a regular basis, and he would grab our boys' testicles. I told counselors, and guess what? There's not been one report about it. No one's done anything about it. He's told them because when he quote unquote was in recovery, all of that was out in the open. I mean, we probably told 10 therapists, including I don't know if you've heard of the Milton Magnus model. We did that too.
Ah, I'm so sorry. We've heard horror stories here at BTR from women talking about sex addiction therapists, but we've also heard horror stories from abuse recovery therapists as well.
Well, one of the reasons you need to get safe right now, I've learned from you, is that when it's abusive, there's so much that you don't even realize it's abuse because it's all foggy. In my opinion, you need separation so you can begin to see more clearly. Like with children who have been abused, let's say it is a father or an uncle or grandfather, like a relative that maybe the family wants them to see eventually again. They'll advise the parents, like, that child needs to not be in a relationship with that person for at least a year. They need to literally get physically away from the abuser so they can get clear on what happened. You can't see clearly what's going on. I mean, believe it or not, in the horrors of our story, I still wanted the marriage and a family because there are pieces that I loved. After all, I married him, right?
Me too. No woman wants to get divorced.
But then sex addiction treatment made all these promises and hopes. And then my ex husband was like a star treatment performer. And so I had all this hope too. I'm very well versed in sex addiction because we've had so many experts and done so many different models, and we've used polygraph, and we went to a really reputable treatment center, et cetera, et cetera. And the sex addiction, the whole thing is he's sort of a victim himself of his compulsive behavior and that he can't stop. We don't ever put that same label on a domestic violence person. In other words, we don't say to someone who physically abuses their family members, oh, well, you can't stop and it's compulsive. You don't have the power to stop that. We expect them to stop that behavior or they're going to be put in jail. With sex addiction, we don't expect them to necessarily stop. There's a lot of empathy and a lot of just like, well, do your best and, keep coming back. But we don't put that same kind of pressure on sex addiction. We treat it as a sex addiction, that it's a problem that they're powerless over. However, if it's domestic abuse, it's completely different. I think there's a huge disconnect.
Yeah, at the beginning, you read a brochure from a domestic violence shelter outlining these behaviors. So there's a huge disconnect between the sex addiction industrial complex and abuse experts because the sex addiction industrial complex does not recognize it as abuse. And then one of the reasons for that disconnect, apart from the fact that they know squat about abuse, is that abusers are manipulative. And when they get caught, they have a quote unquote reason for why they did it. They say things like, I'm so broken, or I was abused as a kid. We all know someone who was abused as a kid, and they're not an abuser. It is a lie that caused him to be abusive. He chose to be abusive. And the sex addiction industry has decided to take these lies at face value. And they've made an entire industry around it. I mean, you and I felt shame. We felt a ton of shame. But we didn't sexually abuse our own children. There are no excuses for this. They are too unsafe for their wife and children. The end. Like, it does not have to be this complicated. It is just abuse.
It doesn't have to be so complicated. He lied to me, he manipulated, and it affected our whole lives. I mean, it's totally affected our socioeconomic status. Everything's changed in our life, and our children have been abused, and yet he's considered to be a sex addict, not an abuser.
And that's wrong. That's why I started podcasting. And that's why I'm on this mission. I want to educate women about abuse. If you're in a relationship with an active porn user, he is abusive and you are a victim of his abuse. I've interviewed so many women and they tell me over and over again the behaviors that they are experiencing. And they're all things that are easily identifiable as abuse by abuse experts. And after interviewing all these women over the years, I know personally that the sex addiction model is not protecting victims of abuse. It is not.
Well, if I had your podcast 10 years ago, I mean, I would have had tools to say, no, this is not about he said, she said, or how do we love each other better, or the 5 love languages, or any of that. I'm married to an abuser. I don't know about you, but I grew up thinking, if you're married to an abusive man, he hits you and yells at you. But mine's the most subversive type. If you're a listener and you can relate to me in that, He didn't really like smack me around. I have no bruises or broken fingers. He didn't yell at me. He was very aggressive and argumentative. He lied to me, manipulated, coerced me. He told me at one point, true story, that he was always 4 steps ahead of me. 4. Think about that. Think about being 4 steps ahead of someone. They do this, I do this. 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 That's insane. I would have had that. I would have been able to identify because, again, I was married to Mr. Nice Guy. Mr. I have a smile on my face while I'm getting aroused with the children. The effects on our children and our family have been grotesque. It's really bad, right?
Yeah, it's horrific. You have been through so much, not just his abuse, but all the abuse from the therapists who were not helping and clergy who were not protecting you. I'm so sorry. I'm so glad that you found my podcast.
So, this has been really monumental for me because we spent thousands of dollars, tons of time, and just every resource trying to help my ex husband recover from sex addiction. It was the wrong path, honestly. But with that, your podcast and listening to the guests on your podcast has really helped me to wake up to this is just an abusive person and to treat the whole thing from a different perspective. One of the things about your podcast, it's called Betrayal Trauma Recovery. So I've recommended it to several friends who have been abused, but everyone thinks it's about just betrayal, right? And I tell everyone it's not, but that's the thing. I think about it a lot, by the way. Pornography, is it freedom of choice or is it just abuse? Because that's the big thing. Pornography, that people say it's a First Amendment thing, right? Like it's freedom of speech. But if everybody came together, you and everybody came together and talked about in our culture, we're allowing this abusive, destructive, it's a national health crisis. We literally have a national health crisis on our hands. And I don't feel like the masses of people are being educated.
Everywhere I go, I say pornography is an abuse issue. It's not a First Amendment rights issue. It's not an addiction issue. It's not a sex issue. Pornography is an abuse issue. It always needs to be addressed from an abuse perspective. When I started Betrayal Trauma Recovery in my area, all of the women who were dealing with their husband's porn use were labeled as having betrayal trauma. And so part of what I wanted to do in labeling this podcast and the organization Betrayal Trauma Recovery was take that term and turn it into what it really is. We are healing from abuse. So I'm trying to make the term mean what it should mean, which is when you are recovering from betrayal trauma, you are recovering from abuse. And the reason you're recovering from abuse is because any betrayal of this type is abuse. It could be called abuse recovery, but so many people right now, they don't see porn as abuse. And so instead they say, oh, she's suffering from betrayal trauma. And then they go down the sex addiction route. And I wanted to be like, anyone who's looking for stuff on betrayal trauma or going down the sex addiction route, I wanted them to find this podcast so that they could get the truth instead of spending years and hundreds of thousands of dollars going down the wrong path. So I wanted to make Betrayal Trauma Recovery the place where any woman who had been emotionally or psychologically abused or been a victim of sexual coercion would be able to come and get the help that she needed. Thank you for sharing your story today. We appreciate your insights.